Hi, in this video we will be learning about the limits of functions, and at the end of this lesson the learner shall have discussed the basic concepts of limits and evaluated limits by use of table of values, by looking at the graph of the function, by substitution, and by simplifying the function first before substitution. Limit is considered as the backbone of calculus, as its concepts are the fundamental foundations to both differential and integral calculus. It is therefore very important that we deeply understand the concept of limits before we deal with derivatives and integrals. In mathematics, a limit is defined to be the value that the independent variable approaches as your independent variable approaches a particular value. This means that when we talk about limits, we describe the behavior of a function near a certain point and not at that particular point. Our keyword here is the term approaches. So, gaanang taog paduol sa usa ka particular value of our x, and ato din gitan-aw unsa ang iyang corresponding y value, and we describe the behavior of the function, and kung unsa man gani ang value nga gi-approach sa atong y as we move closer and closer to a particular x value, then that is our limit. So, to better understand this one, let's have a very simple illustration. Uh, let's have, for example, f of x equals x minus 2 over x minus 2. So for this particular example, or for this particular function, maybe some of you might say nga yung answer is automatically 1 since we have the same term in our numerator and denominator, and you can just cancel them out since parehas naman sila. And anything divided by itself is simply 1, diba? So some of you might say that f of x equals 1, and this given function are just similar, are just equal. But let's try to evaluate if we use 2 as our x value. So let's solve for f of 2. What happens is, kung ato substitute si 2 sa atong original function, this will become 2 minus 2 and then over 2 minus 2. So 2 minus 2 is 0. Our denominator will become 0 as well. And we all know that this one is indeterminate. Unsa man ang indeterminate? Pares lang na sila sa undefined, or the value does not exist. Meaning, we cannot conclude that this function right here, f of x equals x minus 2 over x minus 2, and f of x equals 1 are similar or are equal unless we add the constraint in our second function. Kani siya dire, mag-add ta nga x should not be equal to 2. So, pwede na din ta makaingon nga parehas ra ni sila. F of x equals 1 and f of x equals x minus 2 over x minus 2 if we add the constraint nga x is not equal to 2 or should not be equal to 2, since if our x will be equal to 2, then our function will become indeterminate. So, ato siya i-graph para makita nato unsa di mahitabo sa ato ang graph. So, for all values of x such that x is an element of real number and x is not equal to 2, ang ato ang value sa function or f of x is equal to 1. Kaya bisan pag unsa pa ito i-substitute aning x nato, as long as dili 2, ang answer gid niya is 1. Example, 0. 0 minus 2 is negative 2. Then 0 minus 2 is negative 2. Negative 2 divided by negative 2 is 1. So, sa tanan nga mga values, except positive 2, kay kung positive 2 lagi, mahimo siyang indeterminate, atong value, ang value sa y is equal to 1. So, kato na siya i-graph. So, imagine na lang ang ako ang drawing kay straight line. Pag abot diri sa 2, dili nato na siya ma-diretsyon, no? So, butan na to siya og little gap, and then the graph continues. So, kaning graph or whole diri nag signify or nag describe that our function does not exist if the value of x is 2. But for all other values of x, such that x is an element of real number, ang iyang value sa ato ang y is equal to 1. Now, here comes the concept of limit. Kay, ang atong limit by definition, di ba ganina, we describe limit as the value that your dependent variable y approaches as your independent variable approaches a particular value. Di ba, mamanto siya ang definition. So, as we move closer and closer to 2, for example, in this graph, as we move closer and closer to 2, as long as we are not using 2 as our x value, since kung atong gamiton si 2 as our x value, atong function may mamang indeterminate, ato i-describe unsa day ang behavior sa graph as we move closer and closer to 2 in both directions. Unsa day ang value? Unsa yung value sa y if ang ato ang value or atong x value moves closer and closer to 2. So, if 1, no, atong value, 1 divided by, 1 minus 2 is negative 1 divided by negative 1 is 1. So, 1, if 1.5 atong gamiton, 1 ra gihapon ang iyang answer. So, bisan pa move close kaayo to sa 2 nga atong gamiton is 1.999 na siya, or diri sa pikas kay 2.000001. As long as we are not using 2 as our value, then ang ato ang graph or the behavior of the graph is approaching 1, or ang ato ang dependent variable y is approaching 1. Mo iya ang value nga gina-approach. So, we can say that the limit of this function, the limit of x minus 2 over x minus 2 as x approaches 2 is equal to 1. So, in this case, as we move closer and closer to 2, the value of y is equal to 1, meaning the limit of the function is 1. Kaya ang atong gi-describe kay ang value lang man nga atong gi-approach as our x is approaching a particular value. Dili man yun nga ang value mismo sa f of 2, but the value that our f of x approaches as our x approach a particular value. Muna siya ang concept sa limits. So, later we will have more example or illustration of the concept of limits para masabtan pag yun nato siya. No? So, ngato lang siya ang concept sa limits. We do not take the value nga gihatag sa atua, but we look at the values that are close to that particular value. As we move closer and closer to that value from both directions, from its negative or from the left side and from the positive side or the right side, as we move closer and closer to that particular value, ang iya din corresponding y value ana kailangan po i-approach nga particular value, and in case nga ang imuhang one-sided limits, ato na siya i-discuss unya kung saan definition sa one-sided limits, no, pero ang akong pasabot is katong value nga gi-approach diri sa left side o sa right side, if they are equal, then the limit exists. And kung equal na siya, kung unsa gani na nga value ang ilahang gi-approach, that is the limit of the function. So, we will have more illustration in the later part of this video, kay maybe this is not so clear pa diri nga level or diri pa nga part, diri pa kayo clear on sa definition sa limit, but ato lang yung huna-hunaon that the concept of limit is kanang we approach a particular value, but we do not take that particular value, we approach that value, and as we move closer and closer to that value, ato din gitan-aw ang iyahang corresponding y value, and kung unsa man ganito ang imuhang gi-approach nga y value, that is your limit. Okay, there are 4 ways to evaluate limits. How to evaluate limits? We have first looking at the table of values. We also have looking at the graph of y equals f of x. We have by substitution, and we have by simplifying the function to its simplest form before substitution.